no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a-creeping and crawling, won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMar, and you have tuned into For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. We talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the happiness of your friends and family, and your pets, and the critters and the plants and the insects and all that all around you, because like it or not, we're all mixed up together in this one huge global ecosystem. And I like it. That's why I consider myself an environmentalist. And I hope you like it too, because whether you like it or not, as I said, you're part of it, and you can pretend you're not, but that really doesn't help you or doesn't help anybody, because as we say on this show, a green future, that is the future where we pay attention to the needs of the environment around us as well as our own needs, ends up being a better future for everybody. You're wealthier, you're healthier, you're happier if you live in an ecosystem and an environment that is also healthy and humming along happily. And I have on the show with me today my co-host, my wonderful co-host, Rebecca Wood. So she can jump in anytime here when you're ready. And this morning, before I got on the air, I did my usual thing. I went out and was sort of hoping for some inspiration from the wilds around me, from the environment around me. And my backyard is a little bit wild. I mean, I keep everything within the law in terms of, hey, I have my grass cut and things like that. But there's some little areas that I've let go with some shrubs and some plants, and there's one plant in particular that was I let grow in my yard, and that most people don't. It's called beggar's tick, and it's actually a relative of the sunflower. It's this tall plant that unfortunately it's the one that if you ever go out in the woods, you've had this experience. You come home and there's all these little seeds stuck to your clothes. They're the little black seeds that are sort of sticking up from your clothes. And it's because of those seeds that it's called beggar's tick. And the reason I let it grow is because I read that it's actually food for a lot of wild birds. And I was like, that's interesting. I wonder if that's true. So I let it go all winter, let it go. And I didn't see a lot of feeding on it until the last couple weeks of all that snow that we had in February, that really cold snap when snow covered everything for weeks at the end of February. That's when the birds started eating these beggar's tick seeds. And so, obviously they're not a favorite food, but I'm pretty sure that I've got more birds around my house today because I kept that plant that the birds like to eat. And I was rewarded this morning when I went out and opened my door and just tried to get a little inspiration. And I was rewarded because the backyard is full of the sounds of all kinds of birds getting ready, doing their mating calls, getting their territorial calls in, doing their, hey, good morning calls. And so spring is here. The birds have announced it. And the air was filled with bird song, as they say, which was a really nice start to the day. Rebecca, are you there?
Here, hello.
Okay. We can go ahead and patch Rebecca in at any time. So,
hello.
Oh, wait. Did I hear your voice, Rebecca?
I am here.
Hey. Welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, what do you think, Joe, about sort of if people are planting their gardens? I mean, there's the whole environmentalist garden for wildlife thing versus, arranging your yard to grow food and, reduce the necessity of pesticides and, gas to port the food around, that kind of thing. Which is better, or is it sort of, individual preference?
Well, actually, they both go hand in glove. If you really want to get ecological about it, you do plant plants around. You plant flowers and things that attract the birds and the bees and the butterflies, and they'll help pollinate your plants and keep your plants productive. And the birds will also, after snacking on your the plants you've put there for their benefit, they'll come and they'll eat the insects out of your garden, the ones that are trying to eat your garden. This is a
and I know you're
principle.
You're supposed to plant marigolds, which are pretty to protect your tomato plants from worms or something, right?
Yeah, a lot of marigolds keep a lot of insects away. And one of the things that organic farmers do is they actually will plant a sacrifice row. So they'll have a whole field full of beans or whatever, and then they'll plant a row on the edge of the field that is where they allow the insects that eat those beans to actually eat them unmolested, because what that does is that it concentrates the pests on the row that you've already decided you're not going to worry about. So bugs are like to take the path of least resistance. So if you've got all kinds of measures to discourage bugs in your main field, and you've got this little sacrifice row, they're going to head for the sacrifice row. And B, the sacrifice row actually attracts all the things that eat the bugs, like the birds and the predatory insects that will bring them into your fields. So there's no conflict. You don't have to choose. If you want to do it, ideally, you do both. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I know a little because my dad was an organic gardener back in the 70s.
So you grew up on organic produce. You're the product of a healthy diet. Then is what you're telling us.
Well, a little bit. It was that and the supermarket, and I wasn't really paying attention to what he was doing. So, but some stuff penetrated.
Yeah. So some got in there. All right.
Here they are.
Well, let's see. A few things I wanted to chat about before we get to the main part of the program. And what we're going to do is we don't have a guest this week, but this week is Thursday, March 11th, is the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima disaster. And so what I've done, what we're going to do at the quarter after mark, where we usually have a guest, is I'm going to go through the timeline of that disaster, because I think it's important that we all remember what happened, because the effects of that disaster are going to continue for roughly 1 million years. It's going to be affecting the health and wealth and happiness of our descendants and of all the animals and plants that we share the planet with, because of the radiation it released into the environment. So we're going to do that at quarter after. Then we're going to hear from our wonderful advertisers and patrons. And then, Rebecca, I guess you're going to be talking to us a little bit about an eco-environmentalist.
I am.
Okay, cool. From Ireland.
Actually, I could do several in one in depth if you want, but there's one that was really interesting.
Okay. All right. And then we have some interesting ecological news for you. And hopefully at some point during the show, we will also have you. We would like to have you on the show. This is your invitation to join Rebecca and myself at 866-240-1065, 866-240-1065. And you can call about any environmental topic, anything that's caught your eye or anything that you have a question about, ecologically speaking. But specifically this week, I would like to ask you, what do you remember about Fukushima? I mean, what do you think? Do you even remember Fukushima? I know there's a whole generation of kids that have grown up, and it's been 10 years, and a lot of them have never even heard of the Fukushima disaster, which is arguably the worst disaster in human history in terms of the environment, in terms of ecology, because, as I said, it's going to be continuing for the next million years or so. So, all right.
What I remember about...
You remember?
What I remember about Fukushima is at the time I was working in an office with a woman who had her daughter and grandchildren in Japan stationed there in the military, and it was kind of scary.
Oh, yeah, very scary. All right. Well, as I said, you can join Rebecca and myself, 866-240-1065, anytime during the next hour. We'd love to have you. So just a few things. I wanted to mention that I had finished reading Walden by Thoreau. Mm-hmm. And, it's a very famous book, although a lot of people haven't read it in a long time. It used to be standard reading back in the days, back in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. Pretty much everybody at some point got assigned to read Walden or parts of Walden. And it's a very beautiful book. It's well recommended. Thoreau used the nature all around him at Walden Pond in order to illustrate philosophical and other points that he makes about life and about the world. It's a very inspiring book. It's one of those energizing books. After you read it, you're kind of like you want to take on the world because Thoreau was constantly doing that. Actually, he was taking on the world. Anyway, a couple of things I wanted to note about it. One thing, just in terms of the environment, when he wrote the story back in the late 1800s, he mentioned that there were no deer, because deer actually had at that time been hunted to extinction in most of the east coast of the United States because there was no kind of regulation on hunting deer. I mean, people were allowed to just go hunt as much as they wanted, and the deer were pretty much wiped out over most of the east coast. And most people don't remember that the current high population of deer is a recent thing. It happened after deer were completely eliminated. But one thing he did talk a lot about were chestnuts, which are a fantastic tree that is one of the reasons we were able to successfully colonize the United States of America, because chestnut trees provided all kinds of nutrition and protein to the early settlers. But of course, now there are no chestnuts. The American chestnut tree is functionally extinct, although there is a stand up in Michigan which seems to be protected from Dutch elm disease, which is the imported disease that wiped out the chestnuts, by a native virus that was in the soil. So fingers are crossed. The chestnuts will come back, and there are a lot of people working on that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just rereading recently the Nora Bonesteel Mysteries by Sharon McCrum, and it talks about the chestnuts and how they're trying to bring them back. And also, there's this one sort of subplot in one of her mysteries about these two old friends, elderly Appalachian men. One of them spent his life in Detroit and comes home, and then his buddy immediately gets cancer I think it's a fictional river, the Little Dove River, which has been polluted by a paper company. We're not advocating for this in any way, but, they try all the conventional routes. They go through the newspaper, but it's not an important enough story. They go through the EPA, but they're like, it starts out in this state and it goes to this state, and so we can't do anything. And then finally, this old man is dying of cancer. He has a few weeks. In this book, they end up going to the paper company office and bringing a shotgun with them, forcing the paper company executive to drink a jar of his own water, and he can't press charges. Unfortunately, they can't get any publicity from this because he can't press charges, because that would mean that it was assault, and that would mean the water was dangerous, which would mean admitting something.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely
So they-
don't recommend that.
They have some
I-
fun, but it ends up not being effective because the paper company just wants to hush the whole thing up.
Yeah, and that's the case with most of those violent, because that would be a violent act, and most violent actions don't end up being effective. I mean, we saw that on January 6th when the insurrection, that violent insurrection, has done more to turn people away from sort of insane conservatism and Trumpism than anything else. And they didn't succeed in overthrowing the government. Thank goodness, knock on wood. But but I could see why people would write about it or fantasize about it in a fictional story. But
the point of the plot is to highlight the how hard it is, how bad it is, and also how hard it is to get anything done by conventional routes. Because the system is kind of broken and not responsive to people's needs in a lot of ways.
Well, it does feel like that a lot of times. I mean, one thing I wanted to mention is that tomorrow, on Monday at 5 o'clock, I'm going to be addressing the Bowling Green Municipal Utilities Board to try to get them to overturn their insane fine and penalties on solar power in the city of Bowling Green. And, I've got the facts to back me up. We had our guest on last week, Joshua Pierce, who's done extensive study on this, who has the numbers and can prove that my solar panels aren't a drain on anybody else's finances. In fact, I'm actually subsidizing my neighbors with the cheap solar power I'm putting on the grid right here, right where they need it. So I'm going to go in there armed with the facts, and hopefully I'll be able to convince them to change their policy. But
leave your shotgun at home.
Yeah, no, I don't even own a shotgun, Rebecca. Yeah, sorry.
Me neither, because I would shoot somebody sooner or later. Maybe just someone who got on my nerves. So no guns for me. It's that I'm one of those people who shouldn't have them.
That's prudent.
Yes, I think
yourself,
it is.
Rebecca. Yeah,
there you go.
Good decision not to own that. So, all right. Well, so one other little update I wanted to mention before we get into talking about Fukushima is I had met Richard last week's story. We talked about Charles Young in terms of Black History Month. Well, and I mentioned that his house has been turned into a national monument. I forgot to mention that national monument is right here in Ohio. It's it's in Wilberforce, which is just outside of Xenia, down there, southwest of Dayton, and also right nearby is the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center. So,
cool.
So that's a place to put on your list to go visit right here in Ohio once the pandemic allows things to reopen, which hopefully will be soon. Okay, but one thing that is not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately, is the contamination from Fukushima is not going to go away, because one important thing to remember about radioactive pollution, as opposed to any other kind of pollution, it's not like chemical pollution or even thermal pollution. Radioactive elements cannot be unradioactivized. You cannot neutralize radiation. Now, pro-nuclear advocates claim that you could recycle it, that you could take, spent fuel rods and take that radiation out of them. But what they're doing right there is a complicated lie, because what they mean is you can take the plutonium and the uranium out and reuse them in other fuel rods. That's what they call getting rid of the heavy radioactive elements, which is, of course, not getting rid of them. It's just using them again. But there's over 200 radioactive isotopes created in every nuclear reaction, and you can't do anything about any of them, really. You can't neutralize them. There's no chemical you can add. There's no process where you can spin them around really fast and make them not radioactive. No, they're going to be radioactive until at least 10 of their half-lives have gone through, and they stop being radioactive on their own. And that can take that could take milliseconds. A half-life can be a tiny fraction of a second, or it can take billions of years, as in the case of uranium. So it all depends on the radioactive element itself. So the Fukushima disaster is often described, and I'm going to be quoting today from a webpage on history.com talking about the Fukushima timeline, how an earthquake triggered Japan's 2011 nuclear disaster. And the opening sentence is one that has a glaring inaccuracy that most of the mainstream press still has when they talk about the Fukushima disaster. And that inaccuracy is they call it the worst nuclear event since the meltdown at Chernobyl. And unfortunately, Fukushima is now many, many times worse than Chernobyl. And the reason it's worse than Chernobyl is that this radioactive disaster has been continuing to go. It's for the past decade. For 10 years, those melted fuel rods, those lumps of metal at the bottom of those reactors, which are made up of the molten fuel rods and the molten control rods, have been continuing to react. There's still fission happening in those molten cores. Now, they've been stabilized because they constantly pour cold water over them, millions and millions of gallons of cold water over them. But so they're not actively throwing up steam and they're not exploding like they were 10 years ago, but there's still reactions going on. And we know this because as they pour the water over them, that water becomes radioactive. It becomes contaminated with tritium, and that is caused by the neutrons being continuously thrown off by these reactors that radiate the water, and they absorb the neutrons and become radioactive tritium. So Chernobyl was bad, but at least it's over. It stopped reacting. Fukushima is worse because it's still going. And if the water stops flowing over those molten cores, they will start exploding again and throwing steam up and causing hydrogen explosions and contaminating the whole region again. So it's not over. But it started back on March 11th at about 2:45 in the afternoon. There was an earthquake off the coast, 43 miles off the coast, near Honshu, Japan's most populous island. And the earthquake, that was a magnitude 9.1. It was the largest earthquake in Japan's history and one of the 5 most powerful earthquakes recorded on the Earth. Then that earthquake triggered a tsunami. And at 3:30, it started at 2:45, and about 45 minutes later, the first tsunami wave hits Fukushima. And that was a 13-foot wave, and it was deflected by the seawall, no problem. The seawall went up to 33 feet. So Mother Nature said, aha, so that didn't do it, huh? All right, we'll try this. And about at 3:35, a second wave over 50 feet high smashes over the seawall. And this is the point at which we need to say, I need to go back to what it was like before the Fukushima disaster, before the nuclear disaster. And it's important to remember that the reason the nuclear disaster was able to be so complete and so terrible was because of the cultural decisions that had led up to it. Before the disaster, nuclear power provided 30% of Japan's energy. And it was a natural fit, they thought, because Japan doesn't have a lot of energy resources of its own. It doesn't have oil, and it doesn't have fossil fuels that they can mine. So what they did, they decided they would go nuclear, and there were plans to go even more nuclear, to get up to 50% nuclear. And part of the reason was because of what they called the nuclear village. And that is that the government of Japan and the utility companies in Japan and the people and the nuclear industry in Japan were all interwoven so completely, there literally was no way to separate them. The same people were circulating freely between all three of those organizations constantly. So, sounds kind of familiar, Ohio? Oh, we'll get to that later. So that culture of nuclear worship, basically, people were completely dependent on nuclear for their livelihoods and, for their political careers and for their professional careers. And so decision after decision has been made in Japan, like, for example, the seawall decision. Now, a 33-foot seawall is pretty good, but they had simulations that showed they could be hit by a 50-foot wave. But the cost of building a 50-foot seawall is exponentially higher than the cost of building a 33-foot seawall. So they all just sort of sat around, the conference table and, joked a bit and had another Danish and said, 33 is good enough. So they built a 33-foot wall, and at 3:27 p.m. on March 11th, that wall was breached by reality. The nice little world they had painted for themselves, this picture of a world where there weren't severe earthquakes or big tsunamis. That world was wiped away at 3:27 on March 11th, or 3:35 on March 11th. And so it breaches the wall, destroys the seawater pumps, it drowns the power panels, it goes into the basement where the backup generators are, which is an interesting decision if you have a nuclear plant on the sea coast to keep your backup generators in the basement. Drowns them, they're destroyed. And in 5 out of the 6 reactors there, and that's an important thing to remember about the Fukushima disaster, bad as it is, only 3 of the 6 reactors on that plant were running at the time. The other 3 were in cold shutdown because they were getting maintenanced. And had all 6 been up and running at the time, then the disaster would be more than twice as bad. So anyway, most of the reactors lose power, and the flow of water stops over the cores, and the meltdowns the meltdowns start coming in. And so now that the battery backups were also destroyed. Unit 1, in addition to losing the AC power, Unit 1 at 3:37 loses the DC power. So that only took 2 minutes from the appearance of the wave to losing the backup battery power in addition to the main power, and the control room goes dark. So if you're sitting in the control room of a nuclear power plant and it goes dark, it's kind of like, I'm trying to think what an analogy would be. It's kind of like you're flying a huge tanker truck or a huge fuel tanker. Imagine you're flying a huge fuel tanker and you're starting to come down in for your landing, and all of a sudden, and you can't see anything because the fog is super thick, and all of a sudden all your instruments also go out. You're sitting on top of this huge bomb flying along at hundreds of miles an hour with no way to know what's going to happen or where, if you're about to crash into something. And that's where the people in the Fukushima plants found themselves, in Unit 1. Then they go, and at 6 p.m., a crew goes up to the 4th floor of the Unit 1 reactor to try to get things running again. Their dose meters go off the scale, showing that the core is already, less than 2 hours later, the core is already exposed. The reactor's already melting down, and they absorb tremendous doses of radiation. Now, we are not allowed to know what's happened to those people in the 10 years since then. We don't know how many of them have died. We don't know how many of them have gotten cancers, because part of what's happened as a result of Fukushima is the Japanese government has passed a law saying that it's illegal to report on anything surrounding Fukushima. So there's no story, there's no evidence that people have gotten cancer at a higher rate or are dying 10 years later because of their exposures at this time, because Japanese media are not allowed to report on it. They can't interview people. They can't ask doctors for records. It's completely undemocratic because information is essential for democracy, but nuclear power and democracy never have gone well together. So anyway, these people go, they absorb massive amounts of radiation. At 7 o'clock, well after the plants have started melting down, the Prime Minister, Nado Kan, who since has come out strongly against nuclear power, declares the first emergency and starts ordering evacuations for people 1.9 miles around the plant, which is way too close. And it's also late. The order to evacuate comes at 9, and as we know, the meltdown started back at 6. So for 3 hours, the plant was belching radiation into the air, and then they decide to evacuate it starting at 9. So remember that if you're somebody who lives near a nuke plant like Davis-Besse, at the first sign of emergency, leave, because you're probably not going to get an order to evacuate until well after. Historically speaking, people have not gotten orders to evacuate at Fukushima and at Chernobyl and at 3 Mile Island until well after the plant had already been belching tons of radiation in the air. Okay, so then 6 a.m., the Prime Minister goes to Fukushima himself, and based on what he sees, as opposed to the information he was being fed, he widens the evacuation zone out to 10 kilometers. At 10:09, TEPCO has decided to try venting steam from Unit 1 in order to lower the temperature and the pressure. And venting is kind of your last ditch. It's kind of your desperation measure. It's your Hail Mary pass if you're trying to prevent a nuclear meltdown, because really venting just dumps unbelievable amounts of radiation into the atmosphere, and it's not going to help the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that the water is not flowing, and so the cores are boiling off all the cooling water, and the plant's on its way to a meltdown. That was 10 o'clock on the 12th, 10 o'clock in the morning. At 11 o'clock on the 12th, they try the same thing with Unit 2. And it doesn't work. And at 3:30 in the afternoon on the 12th, the first explosion, hydrogen explosion blowing off the roof of Unit 1. It collapses the concrete walls and only the steel frameworks left. 4 workers are injured in that explosion, and the explosion destroys the electrical cables that they were laying to try to restore power, and it destroys the fire hoses that they had been getting ready to spray water onto the core. And so the explosions not just hurt people, but they also disrupt any attempts to deal with the problem. And then they expand the evacuation zone again right after that explosion out to 12 miles now, 20 kilometers. And at 8:30 in the evening, the pumps have died. There's no water getting in there. They know it's melting down. Absolute desperation. They decide to use seawater to try to cool the melting rods. And they start pumping the water directly from the ocean into the reactor, and that destroys the inside of the reactor in terms of pumps and pipes, because seawater is very corrosive. And now the cooling system, so they start doing that at 8:30 on the 12th. Now the 13th at 6:30 in the morning, or 6:23 in the morning, the emergency cooling system in Unit 3 fails, and they start injecting seawater into Unit 3. And then they start again at about 10 o'clock. The same thing happens with Unit 2. So now you got all 3 reactors in full-scale meltdown. They're desperately pumping seawater in to try to stop them. And now at 11 o'clock on the 14th, 11 in the morning, is the Unit 3 explosion. And that's the explosion that you've probably seen the video of. That's the mushroom cloud. That's the one that TEPCO, to this day, finally admits they don't understand. For the past 10 years, they've been saying it was a hydrogen explosion. They've just finally started saying, okay, well, maybe it wasn't a hydrogen explosion. maybe it was, they've come up with even lamer possible explanations. They're saying it was the gases caused by melting wire insulation, which is crazy because that doesn't even have as much energy as a hydrogen explosion. This is the one that blew the roof, the steel and cement roof of the reactor building 1,000 feet into the air. This is the one that I maintain.
Holy
and
smoke.
a lot of people still maintain, right, was actually a nuclear explosion.
Actually, unholy smoke, I'm going to say.
Yes, and the smoke, right. Hydrogen explosions don't produce smoke because they have, when you burn hydrogen, you just create water. That's it. Just
Wow.
H2, that's hydrogen, plus O2, oxygen, creates lots of H2O, lots of water. So you don't have that big, thick, ugly, dark smoke, and you don't have thousands of tons of steel and cement being blown 1,000 feet into the air either. So that happened on March 14th, a couple days later. And now it's time to pause and just talk a little bit about what's happening for the rest of us, the rest of the world, who's been watching this. The whole world was watching these reactors, in terror of a meltdown. And even on the 14th, by then, a lot of talking heads, a lot of the people you tune into to CNN or you tune into the radio or the television, the spokespeople for the nuclear industries were still at that point saying everything's under control, there's backup systems, nuclear power plants can't melt down, there are just too many redundancies, they're too well designed. And this explosion on the 14th, this mushroom cloud, is the one thing that finally shut them all up. That the whole world was stunned by this. I still remember the first time I saw this film being played on a news show, the anchor literally couldn't say anything. All they did was play it.
We meant to do that at that point.
Yeah.
It's part of the plan. No. Relax. Yeah.
Right. Up to that point, they were saying,
they had no spin. Words failed them.
Exactly. And it's also important to note that there was a lot of disinformation coming out of the U.S. media, too. It's not just the Japanese media or the overseas media. Anderson Cooper went to Japan, went to Tokyo during this thing to try to quell everybody's fear. He was reporting out of Tokyo, and he had a Geiger counter, and he kept comparing the amount of radiation. Oh, well, yeah, it's going up, but it's only so many chest X-rays. It's like, oh, look there, it's this many millirems above normal. That's equivalent to about 3 chest X-rays, to make it sound like something completely innocuous. But of course, the radiation from a nuclear power plant is made up of little radioactive particles that are in the air that when you're exposed to them, you breathe them in, you absorb them, you eat them, you drink them, they get into your body. And so it's like having an X-ray machine inside your body radiating outwards, constantly. Uh-oh. X-rays, you turn them on, you turn them off, you get so much radiation and then it's over. Radioactive fallout from a nuclear plant just keeps going and going and going. So it's like you're constantly getting X-rayed 24 hours a day. And actually it was a little embarrassing for CNN because they finally actually had to pull Anderson Cooper out of there because the radiation levels were getting so high, he was getting scared.
Uh-oh.
So, yeah.
Well, chest X-rays, not good.
Yeah. So that's what was happening in the media at the time. And this is, one of the reasons people don't trust the media is because they were downplaying it. They were saying that emergency procedures are working fine. And it was complete and utter chaos. And then the next day, there's another hydrogen explosion. This one's at Unit 2. So now all 3 reactors, as of the 15th, have had an explosion. So they keep pumping the seawater. They use helicopters to dump seawater onto Unit 3. The radiation levels are just going through the roof. A lot of them are actually so high they can't be measured. And then finally, by the 19th, that's 8 days later, they managed to get some diesel generators up and running. And so they start pumping regular water over the reactor cores, and the damage the cores start cooling. Finally, they start cooling, and it starts sort of devolving, and the temperature on the disaster comes down to where it is, where it has settled down to now 10 years later, where the cores are being held at bay by constant pumping. But the disaster, as I've said, is still ongoing. And one important thing to note that happened right afterwards is that Japan shut down all their nuclear reactors. They went from 30% nuclear powered to zero within a few months of the Fukushima disaster. And they kept their nukes off for, I believe it was well over a year. I think it was like a year and a half, where they had zero nuclear power. And most of what they did, they did have to increase their natural gas burning and their coal burning somewhat, but most of that came from conservation. Most of that came from doing things like staggering shifts on factories so that demand at any one time wasn't too high. They begged everyone in Japan to use as little electricity as possible, and they did. And those factors are mostly why the country was able to keep going after losing 30% of their power, and they proved it can be done. Up till then, another nuclear fallacy was that we must have nuclear power. There's just not enough energy otherwise, and Japan proved that wrong. And most Japanese still don't want any nuclear power, but they've gone back up. I think there's 3 plants running, and they've gone from about 30% nuclear. Right now, about 3% of Japan's electricity comes from nuclear. And, we all remember what's happened since then. And also, one other important thing is that Obama, after the Fukushima disaster, there were calls to shut down the nuclear industry in the U.S., and there were calls all over the world to shut down their nuclear industries. And some more enlightened countries like Germany have heeded those calls, and they are shutting their nukes down. But Obama, in result of who got most of his funding for his first presidential run from Exelon, the nuclear company in Illinois, instead said we're going to stick with nuclear, and he set aside tens of billions of dollars to keep the nuclear industry running. And that's why we're at this juncture where we're about to have to fight the Biden administration, who wants to cover the country with thousands of small nuclear reactors, small modular reactors. So some people have learned, some have not, but it's important to note that the poison, that the radioactive pollution from Fukushima is still continuing. And that's why we ask people this Thursday, the 11th, the anniversary date of the disaster, to join us with Unplugged Nuclear Power, and that is to boycott grid-powered electricity as much as you're able on that day. You can just go around and turn off extra lights. You can go severe restriction. Don't even turn on your computer that day if you want. Or in level 3 is that you disconnect from the grid for a day. Don't do that unless you've planned so that you don't ruin your sump pump or lose the stuff in your freezer. And then level 4 will be putting more power on the grid using solar than you take off the grid that day. So please join us, remembering Fukushima, with Unplugged Nuclear Power this Thursday. Whew, wow. Well, that took a little longer than I thought it would, Rebecca. So we gotta hustle along for the rest of the show. Although we'd still love to take a call at 866-240-1065. So now we're going to hear from our sponsors. Foregrave Future is brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, and they provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead outdoor adventures. Wood County protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy, from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. Several ways to get a hold of them. One is to simply call them at 419-353-1897. You can also go to their website, wcparks.org. You can download their nifty app from any app store. Just search for WC Parks. And one thing we'd like to urge you to do is go to their website and download their Green Passport, which is a Go Green Passport. It's a fun little activity you can do with your family, which involves visiting parks and doing ecologically responsible activities. For Green Future is also brought to you by our patrons, and these are wonderful people who I can't praise enough, fantastic people who've gone to patreon.com and they searched for a Green Future, and they picked a level of monthly donation that matches their budget, and every month a little bit painlessly comes out of their account and joyfully comes into ours. So we'd love to thank our patrons. All right, so Rebecca, let's hear about Irish environmentalists.
All right, well, I'm just going to, seems we're short on time, I'm going to skip to Sister Majella. Sister Majella, I've lost her last name. Sister Majella McCarron, yeah. Sister Majella McCarron is famous for having been a great correspondent and human rights advocate for Ken Saro-Wiwa and his friends when they were, really even going back before they were in prison in Nigeria for, it was actually gas, it wasn't oil, for opposing the Shell Corporation's, whatever, Dutch something, they're
Dutch Royal Shell, right?
Dutch Royal Shell, yes, thank you. Just destroying a bunch of villages along the Niger. Basically, they did this by smuggling letters in and out of prison by bread baskets. And several people were in on it, including Nelson Mandela got letters from Ken Saro-Wiwa and his friends. There were 9 other activists with him who were eventually executed for a nonviolent campaign to highlight the environmental degradation in the Niger Delta. She apparently, she's part of a missionary order in Nigeria, and she met him while lecturing on education at the University of Lagos. And she taught in Nigeria for 30 years with the Missionary Institute of Our Lady of Apostles. I think it's important to remember here that the Irish actually have a great history of solidarity but with other groups, other oppressed groups, both to and from, actually. I mean, there was a thing where with that Irish brigade that fought in the Mexican War of Independence. I think they were sent down there to put down the Irish, and they were like, yeah, no, we like these people, or to put down the Mexicans. And they changed sides because they could sort of see that their situation was more in common with the Mexicans than not. There was the thing, I believe it was the Cherokees sent them some trifling amount. They were fresh off the Trail of Tears, poor as dirt, but they sent some amount under $100 during the height of the famine. And somebody just recently, I think, put up a memorial to that tribe or that chief in Ireland as thank you. So they forgot about that. Or there was a thing, if you see the movie In the Name of the Father, there's a thing where, what's the fella, Jerry O'Connell or O'Connor, I forget which, the guy who was tortured into a false confession, and he and his father spent years in jail. Yeah, there's the whole scene where he has the prison friendship with the Jamaicans who are in solidarity because they're both, victims of the British Empire. But she initially contacted him as asking him to be her activism mentor, and she lobbied for European Union relief for the Ogoni villages that were destroyed in 1993. They were such close friends that she collected his 1994 Nobel Prize that he got while he was in prison and delivered his speech for him. And there's a book of their correspondence and some of his poems, and an archive of photographs that's at it's an ebook, and there's an archive of writing and photographs in the Maynooth University now that she bequeathed to them. It's called Silence Would Be Treason. And it includes several other Irish authors, including the poet Numi Bassi. And I did not know that Ken Saro-Wiwa was himself a poet, apparently. And one of the interesting things he says in here is that the Nigerian soldiers, were so poor that were guarding him. He had to feed them out of his prison food. It was crazy. But I wanted to end with this one quote in this book that he dedicated to Majella. He writes these lines: "What is it, I often ask, that unites County Fermanagh and Ogoni? Ah, well, it must be the agony, the hunger for justice and peace, which married our memories to a journey of faith." I thought that was really beautiful.
Which marry our memories to a journey of what?
Journey of faith.
What's the last word? Faith.
Faith. Yes. Faith.
Yeah, that's a beautiful line. And
she's still active in environmental causes also in Ireland.
Yeah, what was her name again?
Sister Majella McCarron.
Sister Majella McCarron, yeah. And that connection actually between the Irish and the Native American tribes is still very strong. They still exchange things to this day. They each remember what they did for each other. So,
right.
All right. Well, that's an inspiring story from a real tragedy. And I think she would probably, and Ken Saro-Wiwa, if he were still alive, would probably be somewhat cheered by the fact that Shell is finally starting to be held legally responsible for the things that they've done in the Niger Delta, which is just a horrible environmental and human rights disaster. So
really awful.
So some progress there. And thank you, Rebecca, for that report.
You're welcome.
All right. Now, on to ecological news. And we got to go pretty quick. So
okay.
One thing I wanted to note is last night I watched on the, PBS on the News Hour. They did a whole big long story on the Line 3 controversy, and they were interviewing people from the GNU Collective, which is great that story is finally getting some national attention on a big thing. But I also kind of had to note that we scooped them. We beat them to it by roughly 2 months, I think. Yeah, so just tooting our own horn there a little bit.
There you go.
House Bill 6 update. And there's been all kinds of wonderful reporting as more and more information's coming out about just how corrupt this whole process was that put House Bill 6 in place and then kept it there despite determined opposition from people like myself who wanted it to go on the ballot as a referendum so that the people of Ohio could have some sort of say in this. And Laura Bischoff of Dayton Daily News this past week did a very detailed report that connects a lot of the dots. And Governor DeWine is very deeply wrapped up in the whole process, which we all thought at the time, but nobody could say out loud because you can't say these things until there's some evidence of it. Well, the evidence of it is that First Energy gave him about $1 million just before HB6 was introduced, and
wow.
So now there's some evidence of it. We can start saying these things out loud. It looks like DeWine is probably, and I have to keep using the probablys until people are convicted, probably deeply mixed up in this horrible, corrupt event. But there was also a story by Energy and Policy Institute on March 3rd by Dave Anderson that I really want to draw people's attention to, because one little bit of information that's in this story that I haven't seen in any of the others that I wanted to tell you about is that First Energy reached an agreement with their lenders in November before the whole scandal happened, or that they reached an agreement with their lenders, and they got from the lenders limited waivers for breaches of their credit agreement provisions that required compliance with anti-corruption laws. Let me translate that for you. What they did, First Energy went to their lenders, the people that essentially owned the company because they had lent them so much money, and they got permission from them to break anti-corruption laws before they went and started paying all these bribes and doing all this, putting out all this information and making all these illegal campaign contributions. In other words,
so
they
it's
didn't
almost
care
as if
about,
that was not a mistake that they made there, or they kind of knew in advance that it was not okay.
Right. They didn't actually care about breaking anti-corruption laws, because they knew with somebody like Governor DeWine at the head of the state government, they probably wouldn't have to deal with that. Of course, this is all speculation. This is my opinion. But they were afraid that by breaking those anti-corruption laws, they would be in violation of their loan agreements, and they would have to repay their loans all at once with really high interest. They were afraid of the fiscal penalty, so they went to their lenders and got permission to do it.
Oh, Lord.
And that, to me, sums up everything that's wrong with our country today.
Pretty much.
A couple more quick things. Wolf hunt update. Yeah, it was worse than we thought, because in addition to the couple hundred that were killed within 60 hours in Wisconsin, turns out there's also very likely another 115 or 100 or so that were killed by poachers at the same time. So it looks like in 60 hours, the state of Wisconsin wiped out somewhere around 30% of their wolf population. And it was all mostly alphas who were pregnant or having pups.
Oh,
so
my God.
almost wiping out a huge hit on the wolf population. And then another story we're going to have to really get into detail, because there's some details on this next week. Actually, we're out of time. Can't even get to that story this week. Love you all. Thank you all for listening. Let's hope pray for no more Fukushimas. This is Joe DeMar.
And Rebecca Wood.
And we are signing off. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was undone.